He was very upset. I was in the shower. He thought I was out with someone else. He was asleep the next morning on my porch, waiting for me to see where I was. Okay, now the good things. He's very good looking. I find him physically attractive. That's about all. I've been sitting here for 10 minutes with pen in hand, and I can't think of another good thing to say about him. Don't bother answering this letter. You've helped me more than you can imagine. That's what happens. You sit down, you write it out, and you see things you never saw before. Writing helps you solve problems. People who keep diaries know all about this. Diary is a great place to write down your personal problems, your observations. As you write it, you figure out better solutions. You have a problem, you write it down. At least 10% of the problem goes away just by writing it down. Now, the secret to all this, secret number 3, the big one, revision. Very important. Revision is the core of what we call the composing process. The letter I just read to you, she didn't need to revise. Most of the time we do, and we find out new things. Neil Simon, great playwright, is probably the most prolific and successful American playwright. He says 90% of his work is revision. Mediocre writers write, good writers rewrite, and that is the difference. Kurt Vonnegut is the source of a great deal of wisdom, the novelist. He says, writing allows even a stupid person to seem halfway intelligent. If only that person will write the same thought over and over again, improving it just a little bit each time, a lot like inflating a big balloon with a bicycle pump. Anybody can do it. All it takes is time. Anybody can do it. Vonnegut was a very interesting guy. He said that when he lived in Chicago, he was invited to television talk shows. There'd be people around a table making wise and intelligent comments. He said he was on the show twice. He never said anything. They kept inviting him back. They thought he was wonderful. The same thing with me. If I haven't thought about something, I have no opinion. Vonnegut says he was once giving a speech, and a woman in the audience raised her hand and said, "How can you be so pessimistic? What kind of a model are you giving to young people today?" And he couldn't think of anything to say, so he walked off the stage. I'm the same way. I have nothing to say unless I've tried to write about it. Then you see. The next quote is one of my all-time favorites, and it has done a lot for removing my biggest writer's block, and that's the first draft. When I have to write something, if you see an article by me, it's probably gone through 20, 30, 40 drafts. The first draft is the hardest because my ideas aren't clear at all. Hemingway got it right. He says, the first draft of anything is shit. Isn't that wonderful? Once you understand that, you lose your fear of writing. You know it's not going to be good, but you need to do the first draft, and that's it. Okay, planning. Planning follows from this. They tell us to plan, have an outline, etc. We were taught in school how to outline, and that was pretty good stuff. But you can plan any way you want. You can use formal outlines, informal outlines, but realize you have to be willing to change your plans. Don't stick to the outline. As you write, you'll come up with new ideas and you'll need a new plan. That's not bad news, that's good news. That means you're learning something. In fact, Peter Elbow says, when you think you're done with your essay, outline it again. Go through it again. I was on an airplane from Los Angeles to Hong Kong. That's like a 12, 13-hour flight. And I thought I had had my paper all ready for the conference. For once in my life, I had it all done. And I thought, well, I can just relax. I can watch violent and funny movies on the plane and, just be a human being for a change, Ser Romano. And I then sat down and someone sat next to me. The flight attendant brought in someone else. And it was this big, ugly guy. He looked like he had just escaped from prison, you know what I mean? And had killed all the guards on his way out. He had his sleeves rolled up, big muscles, and he had tattoos. And I pretended to be really macho. Okay, how you doing there, buddy? Okay, yeah. And then he fell asleep. He fell asleep on my shoulder. Oh no, that's not for me. What do you do? Well, the plane had taken off, so I could get up. I got up, I took my computer with me, and there's an area on all these long flights where you can get a balanced diet of Coca-Cola and potato chips. So I put my computer down, standing up, had my Coca-Cola and potato chips. I reread my paper, and as usual, I listened to Peter Elbow, and I did the outline all over again. It was amazing. I found so many mistakes. I'll say this again later. There's nothing wrong with being wrong. In fact, it's a good thing, when you find out. And I revised it. I found better ways of saying things, more subtle interpretations. I re-outlined the paper, and I had a lot of time on the flight. I rewrote the entire paper, start to finish. The paper was much, much better. That's what revision does for you. You think you're done, you want to get through, take your time, revise, revise, revise. Secret 4, and I already said it, there's nothing wrong with being wrong. Be happy about revision. Revision is how you get smarter. That's why writing is so good for you, because you're always revising and coming up with better ideas. The next point, which illustrates this, the next example, comes from my son, who's a mathematician, and his wife, who's also a mathematician. Basically, it came from her, Angela. She's a specialist in algebraic geometry. And this is from John Tate, who was in algebra and algebraic geometry, who died a couple of years ago. He was in his 90s. He was one of the most respected mathematicians in the world. Okay, this guy was wonderful. If you look up John Tate, then you find the Wikipedia entry, article after article, insight after insight, etc. Well, my son and his wife Angela found a quote about John Tate. It said, John Tate, this is a math teacher, Amy Cohn. John Tate once said something like this to my honors class. Someone asked him, how do you spend your time? Well, about 50%. I spend my time working hard and not getting anywhere. 10% of my time making some progress, a little bit, and 40% of my time wondering how I could be so stupid, wondering how I could be so unproductive 90% of the time. I wrote my son a note yesterday. I said, today was another John Tate day, okay? This is normal. Again, this was said by the best of the best in one of the most demanding fields, John Tate. We think we should be making progress all the time. And here Amy Cohn says, even smart people struggle and waste time worrying about it. Campbell's work in the Simonton's work, Scientific Genius, many potential creators are inhibited by a belief that others solve problems directly. Oh, that must come easy to you. You just write it down and the ideas just flow. No, that's not true of anybody. It's everybody goes draft to draft, revision, revision. The difference between me and the people who suffer, I understand that's the process. I don't blame myself, and I'm having a good time. I expect it to happen. I expect to find mistakes. Charles Darwin, same thing. I cannot remember a single first-formed hypothesis which had not after a time to be given up or greatly modified. All our new ideas are imperfect. We work on them, we change them, I've had the same conversation with several of my colleagues, with my son, with my daughter-in-law, my colleague, Nushan Ashtari, who's just joined us from the States. We talked about, we do a lot of work together, and our conversations generally end with, boy, this conversation is so different than what we were talking about a week ago. So much has happened. That happens through revision, written, spoken, back and forth. There's a book by Hans Ohanian that I really like. It's about Albert Einstein. It's a biography of Einstein. It's called Einstein's Mistakes. The Human Failings of Genius. I got a free copy of the book on PDF before it was published because Hans Ohanian's wife, Susan Ohanian, to me is the leader of the field of education in elementary school, especially in language arts. And she knew that I was interested in Einstein, so she sent me a copy of Hans Ohanian's book, her husband's book, and I wrote a comment back. Let me tell you what was in the book, Einstein's Mistakes. Einstein went back and forth all the time, constantly giving something up, going back, revising. There was one part of it where he submitted an article to a physics journal with all kinds of mathematics. The next year, he submitted another article to the same journal, a better solution, he said, to the problem he thought he had solved the year before. The next year, you know what's going to happen. Another paper, another improvement. Says last year I was wrong. He did it 4 years in a row. This is Albert Einstein who goes through this constant revision. Well, I wrote a note to Susan and Hans, and I said, Hans made one big mistake in the title. Not the human failings of genius. The book tells us more than Einstein's mistakes. To paraphrase Kepler, the astronomer, it reveals the wondrous and twisted roads that lead to knowledge. This is true of everybody all the time. Okay. I had a colleague at USC. This is before we sent papers out on the computer and PDF and all this. He would write his papers and then share them with other people, including me. And as soon as he had his first draft, he would put a stamp on it and it said, "This does not represent my current position. It's going to change. This is the way it always goes." Okay, let me go on and give you the other secrets. Secret number 5, reread. Reread what you did the night before. I rise at first light, and I start by rereading and editing everything I've written to the point I left off. Ernest Hemingway said this, okay? We all do this. You're anxious to finish. You've got a deadline. You've got other stuff you need to do. Reread what you did during the night while you were sleeping. Your subconscious mind was working on your paper. You were, as we say, incubating. New ideas came. You can get up the next morning and you can harvest the results of the work of your subconscious mind. I'll come back to this. This is a big point. Secret number 6, piece of advice number 6, I got it from Peter Elbow, but everybody says it. It's very good advice. Delay editing. While you're writing, don't worry about punctuation. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about grammar. In my case, in Spanish, I don't worry about ser and estar. It's late acquired. I have learned it, but not acquired it. So I'm not going to worry about it while I write. I'll go back and worry about this later. There's a good reason, a couple of reasons. Number 1, if you constantly are worrying about mechanics, spelling, grammar, it's going to disturb your flow of thought. You won't be able to think about ideas. You'll just think about the cosmetic part of writing and it will distract you. Also, the draft you're working on now is probably not your final draft. You're going to revise it. Don't put on your makeup before you take your shower. I would never do that, okay? It's the same idea, okay? It inhibits ideas and it's a waste of time. Okay, secret number 5. Let's go back to incubation. Graham Wallace. I discovered Graham Wallace, 40 years ago in the University of Texas, El Paso Library. I was giving a talk at what we call UTEP, University of Texas in El Paso. And it was the day before, and I spent time in the library doing my work. And during breaks, what I like to do in libraries is browse around and see what's on the shelves. Those days we had shelves and journals and books, and you could open them up and look at them. It was really interesting. And I found a book called The Art of Thought. I picked it up, looked interesting, a guy named Graham Wallace, published in 1926, written before that. It was so interesting, I Xeroxed the entire books. Those days in libraries, there were things called Xerox machines, and you could use your change, your spare change, and you could Xerox copies, and I always had plenty of small change with me. I copied the entire book. I still have it. Best investment I ever did. Wallace had this hypothesis about how we solve problems, and it's also the composing process. First thing you should do when you have a problem is get it clear in your mind. And you'll see later, we get it clear by writing, not our final version, just to clarify our thinking. Then you go through revision. And when you come to a problem, and this happens all the time, Graham Wallace says, stop, take a break. Take a break, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and do something mindless, like meditation, something that does not require creative thought. I have found that I can't do one creative project and then take a break doing another one. That doesn't work. You have to do something really stupid. That's why we have so much, we call it shit work, okay? To do, it's to help us incubate. I'll tell you how I do it, and you'll get the point. Here's Toll, who wrote a book called The Power of Now. Our breakthroughs come when we're in a place of no mind, at a time of mental quietude. I got a lot from a mathematician here, Poincaré. He wrote a paper published in 1924, which has been republished in every collection I have ever seen on creativity. Mathematician. He says, when I'm doing my math, I run into problems I can't solve. Happens. I get up, put some wood on the fire, that's all, then come back. I do this too. I really like doing dishes. I got to admit to you, when we have guests, even when we don't, I do the dishes in the house. And when I do dishes, I want to brag to you how good I am at doing dishes. I can take a job that the ordinary person can do in 20 minutes, and I get it done in 2 hours. That's how I work. I bring my computer into the kitchen, and the first thing I do is start the project I'm writing about. It's a letter to the editor. It's reading something I have to comment on, a creative paper, and I get a writer's block immediately. My life is writer's block after writer's block. That's all it is. I then get up from the computer, wash 3 dishes, and put away 2 that I left out. Then I go back to the writing, wash 3 more dishes, put away 2. When I'm halfway done, I put away 3 and I wash only 2. 2 hours later, I have written my article, I have written my letters, I've answered correspondence, and the kitchen is clean. I want also to tell you about my secret life in hotel rooms. We used to do that a lot. We used to travel a lot and go to hotel rooms. Oh, well. What does Steve Krashen do in the hotel room? Here is the deep, deep, dark secret. There's nothing more boring in a hotel room than unpacking. So the first thing I do is I take my computer out, open it up, start to work. Absolutely, within 3 minutes, my first writer's block appears, of course, okay? Now, what do? I get up, I take the suitcase, put it on the bed and open it up. That's all. Then I go back to the manuscript. Within 2-3 minutes, I have another writer's block. I go to my suitcase, I take out a shirt, because you got to hang up your shirts, right? I hang up 1 shirt, that's all. Go back to the writing. 2-3 hours later, I have finished the work I have to do. I've had a very good evening's work, and the room is clean, so I'm not embarrassed when the cleaning lady at the end comes in and you know, it's a big mess, etc. I think all the years I've been traveling and staying in hotels, I have never once turned on the television set because I've had so much to do, unpacking, cleaning up, and mostly doing the work and using, well, the fancy expression for shit work is inauthentic labor. That is given to us to incubate when we have our ideas. Okay. Okay. Another, the big secret. Oh my God, this is, I should have put this in big bold type and put it in red. Secret number 8. Writing is the source of inspiration. Stephen King. Don't wait for the muse. Don't wait for the creative spirit to come with all these ideas. Your job is to make sure the muse knows where you're going to be every day from 9 till noon or 7 till 3. Do your work with breaks and creativity will arrive. Susan Sontag, good writer. You can't wait for inspiration. Here's the big one, Madeline L'Engle, Swiftly Tilting Planet. Inspiration usually comes during work rather than before it. You can't just go for a walk and worry, gee, I don't have an idea yet. What should I do? And you put it off. Sit down. Write that first draft, which Hemingway has told you is going to be shit. Don't worry about it. The ideas will start to come. I think these ideas are not just valid for academic writing, which is what I'm doing here. It's true for creative writing as well. It's true for all kinds of creative work. Living in Southern California, you know about California. It's all showbiz, right? You must be involved in show business or you get no respect. If you're in your car and you're speeding and the police come and say you're going too fast and where are you going? And you say, I'm going to a rehearsal of my new play. They will let you go and give you a police escort. That's how important it is to be in show business. So the last 12 years, I have been actively involved in show business, and I'll tell you about it. And I'm going to make this point because it really fits very, very well. I write musicals. In the last 10 years, I have written 11 musicals, and they've all been performed. I write them for the synagogue. Every year we take, this is for the holiday of Purim, which is based on the book of Esther. We write a musical based on the book of Esther, the Purim holiday. And the plot is always the same plot. But what you do is you take a musical, like West Side Story we did one year, and you use the same songs and you change the words to make it fit the story of Esther. By the way, all Jewish holidays have the same plot. The Jewish holidays all do this. They tried to kill us. We were saved. Now let's eat. So that's Purim. That's what goes on. And it all takes place in Persia, of course, and Esther saves everybody and all this. Anyway, the cast is always the same. I take people that I sing with every year in the choir. I like singing in the choir because this is before the big Jewish holidays, the New Year's, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, which are pretty heavy holidays, and you're there all day. And if you're in the choir, you really pay attention. And the rehearsals are wonderful because the cantor not only rehearses you, but he explains, gets you in the mood for the holiday. So you're actually quite an active, sincere participant, thanks to his really good work. So the cast members are always in the play are always choir members. And about, even this time of year, they start talking and you say, well, Steve, what's the play going to be this year? What's the Purim play? What are we going to base it on? I say, I don't know. I haven't thought about it. Then it gets closer and closer and closer. And I still haven't thought about it. And I start to panic, procrastinate, panic, etc. Then I remember Stephen King. Then I remember Madeline L'Engle. And I remember Ernest Hemingway, above all. I have no ideas, nothing. All I know is the general outline. I don't know what musical, what movie I'm going to use. I sit down and I start writing. I know what the first act is. It's Queen Ahasuerus who gets angry at his wife and she won't dance in front of her friends. When I do the play, it's because she won't dance. The real script says she won't dance naked. He wants to show off his wife's body and all. He's quite a crazy guy. Anyway, and she leaves, or she says, no, I'm not going to do it. First feminist, and he banishes her. In the Jewish commentaries, he executes her. In the Christian commentaries, he simply bans her, sends her away. I use the Christian commentary. I have permission of the rabbis. Anyway, I sit down with a blank page and I start looking at the characters. Who's in the first act? What can I do? I stare at the page, I write something, cross it out. I work for maybe 10 minutes. That's all, with the confidence that my a subconscious mind is going to work on it. The next day, I might work for 15 minutes, a little more, and change everything from the day before. Here's the magic. At the end of 2 weeks, the first draft is done because your subconscious mind takes over. This is so interesting and so correct. This is what really happens. Well, I then do the first draft. I'll tell you what happens then. In my own work, I generally don't show my work to anybody. I generally look at it myself, etc. But in terms of my creative work like this and fiction and playwright, I show it to the cast. And of course, I show it to the cantor, the chief singer, the musical director. He has a background in music, of course, a professional singer, and he also has a background in the theater. He's done choreography, the whole thing. So we sit down and go through the whole thing. He makes so many corrections because he knows the stage better than I do. He can visualize it. I can't. We always go to Denny's, this cheap restaurant in Santa Monica. One time, this is irrelevant, but I'm happy to share this with you. We had spent 2 hours sitting in a booth going back and forth. He says, this will never work, change this, change that. Mostly he's right, nearly always the time he's right. And we were kind of humming the tunes to each other. When we got up, the couple from the next table applauded. They said, we really liked your singing. Please come back. Okay. That was our first performance. It really worked. Anyway, the next point. This is secret number 9. And I applied this when I wrote the play, and I apply it now. I worked this morning on a manuscript, made good progress. Daily, regular writing. Wonderful work here. There is a novelist named Irving Wallace, a very interesting guy. He's written some great novels, and they've made into movies, etc. He's a successful, popular author and a very good one. He did a study. He actually published co-authored a paper, I think with a psychology professor in a journal, about writers and how they write. Do they keep hours? He found the best writers, all of them were regimented to some extent. The vast majority of writers keep some semblance of regular daily hours. Wow, it's like going to a job. When they write, variable. Michael Chabon, very good writer. He worked all night. He's my kind of guy. From 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. Nushan, this is for you too. This is the way you work to get things done. Maya Angelou, oh gosh, she's so good. Maya Angelou would go out and rent a hotel room in her neighborhood. And she's a morning person. She would start at 6:30 in the morning and write until early afternoon. She wanted a quiet place, no one to bother her, and that's how she got it done. Some people, most people are timekeepers. Some, according to Graham Walls, are page counters. They write a certain number of pages each day. The champion of this, of course, Stephen King, 10 pages a day. I mean, my goodness, he's amazing. Some are word counters. Stephen King, 2,000 words or 10 pages, etc. I want to tell you what I do, and I tell you this with some reluctance, because I'm not telling you to do this. You have to discover your own rhythm, your own capacity, what works for you. When I have a big project, which is all the time, I'm a word counter, always. And I have a quota. This works for me. 600 words. They don't have to be refined. They don't have to be edited, but 600 words in some form. If I do 550 words, I don't feel right. I have to go back and get to 600. If I do 605, it's no good. My mind turns off. I get stale. So that works for me. If you become a word writer, it might be more, it might be less, but whatever keeps you going. A guy named Robert Boyce, I got to meet this guy sometime. He's a professor of counseling at State University in New York. I forgot which one. And he did a study of junior faculty members. One of his jobs was to help junior faculty get things published. Now, those of you who understand academia, you know about the frightening tradition of tenure. Oh gosh, you get a job at a university, you're a junior professor, and you have a few years to write a pile of papers. And then people judge whether you will live or die. The committee, they look at your papers and they either you get lifetime employment, tenure, or you get fired, which means you're fired and it's hard to get another job. So he looked at those who got tenure and those who didn't. Those who got tenure, here it is in the handout, they had a regular, moderate habit of writing. They wrote a little bit each day, some of them 40 minutes, some of them 2 hours. It didn't matter, but they all had some regularity in their writing. I have to write every day. If I don't write every day, everything goes wrong. Here is Charles Dickens. He needed, if he missed one day of writing, he needed a week of hard work, hard slog to get back into the flow. Same with me, absolutely. I need to do something every day, at least if I have no time at all, at least 5 minutes here, there, and then your mind keeps working on it. You don't forget it. You don't forget what you're going to do. The ones who made it, according to Boyce's research, were daily regular writers. They had quotas, amount of time, pages, words. They did something like that. The ones who didn't make it, without exception, were what he called binge writers, B-I-N-G-E. Binge is an important word for those of us who've been on diets. When you're on a diet, here's what happens until you know better. 5 days a week, 6 days a week, you stick to your diet. You cut down on sugar, okay, drink more coffee, do all the things that are good for you. And then the last day, oh, I've been such a good person all week, I'm going to binge. I'm going out and I'm going to have ice cream, okay? I'm going to go off my diet. Same thing. Binge writers, he calls them binge writers, are not daily regular writers. They're self-indulgent writers who write only when they feel like it. They say, well, I'm not going to write today because the mood isn't right. And, and I need a perfect place to write. I need a quiet room where there's no noise at all. Traffic can't go by my house. They have to divert them. Airplanes should never fly overhead while I'm working, etc. And they say, I need at least 5 hours of uninterrupted, beautiful time, then I can write. None of these people made it. First of all, they rarely got the 5 hours. When they got the 5 hours, they spent it staring at a piece of paper or at the computer screen because they had lost their place. One of the reasons people fail at writing, their breaks are too long, like a day, and then they don't know where they are. Peter Elbow says, it's like having a big ball of string and you can't find the end. That's exactly what goes on. If you do daily regular writing, you always know where you are. This is a powerful, I think, idea. Okay, the secret number 10 is a little bit counterintuitive. It says, write before you read. It actually makes sense. What we usually do, and I've been, my other lectures and writings, reading is so important. That's where we get all our facts and our writing style. But when you start out, Peter Elbow says it's a good idea. You're not clear where you're going, which is always, start writing. Write before you read. Don't read everything. You go in and you say, I'm going to do a paper on whether when cows moo, whether they have their own dialects from their own group, okay? So I'm first going to read all the mooing articles, all the cow articles that I can, all the animal language articles, see if that's true. Bad idea. That's before you have any ideas. You start reading the articles, you get lost. You don't know what they're talking about after a while. You can't keep the ideas straight. You forget what you read. Write first when you know less. That's a quote from Elbow. Get your ideas down on the page. Then you get your ideas, which may be wrong. Doesn't matter. You can change them. After your ideas are clear, after you have some hypotheses in mind, then start to read. Then start to read to see what other people say, whether they agree with you, whether they have similar ideas, etc. Read only what you need to read to solve the problem you're working on now. Don't read something because you think, gee, I really should. I've had this experience, I'm sure you've had it, cleaning up my office. I come across journals and books, some of which I came in the mail maybe a week ago. I read some of the articles right away. I think, gee, this is important. I should know about this. And I see my handwriting in the margin, my underlining, maybe a week later. And I have no knowledge whatsoever, no memory of having read the article. It didn't solve a problem for me, so I don't remember it. It doesn't matter. It's wasted time. We remember things when they solve a problem for us. That's the whole theory of memory. Frank Smith points out in his discussions of memory that the studies of memory, so many repetitions, reinforcements, are all based on studies using nonsense words. It's how well you remember nonsense. When you put meaning in, everything changes when it's important to you. Let me make the point by reciting some romantic poetry. Do you love me or do you not? You told me once, but I forgot. Now, the reason that's nonsense is that you don't forget things like that. When it solves a problem for you, you remember forever. The phone rings and it's your cousin. You and your cousin were out shopping the other day and you bought a lottery ticket in the United States. You bought a lottery ticket for $20. You each paid $10 and your cousin calls you and says, guess what? We won. we won $500. I'm coming over. I'm going to give you your half, $250. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Then you hang up the phone. You don't say, who was that on the phone? What did he want? Did I win something? How much was it? No, you remember. You remember forever because it solved a big problem. Namely, you needed a little bit of money that week, okay? So read what you need to read to solve the problem you're working on now. Don't worry about keeping up with the literature. This isn't school. You're not preparing for a surprise quiz. That's not what goes on in the real world. A guy named Bezeman did a wonderful paper about physicists and how they behaved in libraries. Most of my life was spent in academic libraries until computers took over. I'd work in libraries and always look at the new journals when they came and the Xerox papers, that I believed in. If you think someday you might need it, make a file, keep it for later. That's what they did. These top physicists looked at all the new articles in physics, papers that they might be interested in later, they made a copy of and kept. They only read papers that helped them with the research they were working on today, right now. If you violate this and you read something because, gee, I should know this, you're going to forget it immediately, like it never happened. So be like Bezeman scientists, only read what you have to read. I know what you're thinking. We'll come back to this. School doesn't allow you to do this. School's got it all wrong, let me tell you. Okay, let me talk about writing up journal articles that are scientific papers. I'll talk about scientific empirical papers, but I think the point goes for all serious writing. The usual paper that I read and write also is very often empirical. It's got numbers, it has statistics. Okay, and so what I do first, every single paper has one table that is crucial and important. And that is the core of the paper. Everything else is just commentary. So when you're writing, tell people, what part should I write first? Don't begin by writing the introduction. Begin by constructing the central table. Let's say you did an experiment. One group had 4 cups of coffee. One group had, chocolate milk, and you see which one does a better job remembering the series of numbers. Of course, the coffee people do better. And you have statistics, a test, all that. You're going to put it in a table. You can have group 1, their mean score, group 2, their mean score. Then you'll have the statistics. Do that first. That's number 1. When you have the major table made, when you've got your main result clear in general, the rest is easy. Delay the rest till you know where you're going. If it's an empirical study, quantitative, then do the other tables. How many subjects, How old were they? How much did they weigh? Whatever was crucial to the article. After that, you write the methodology section, how you did it. Then you write the conclusion. After you get results, conclusions are all the same. The first paragraph of the conclusion is always you do the quick summary, and that's usually a good place to start reading. And after that, the apologies, what I did wrong and why this experiment is garbage. And you have to do that. And then there's a long section, which I think is completely useless, where they tell people how they should run their lives, what experiment should come next. I never do that. It's none of their business. People figure that out. The last thing you do is the introduction, not the first thing. And you only put what you need in the introduction, not a complete history. Now, let's say you finish the article and it's the real world article. People tell us, when you're writing something, consider your audience. Make sure you're writing this for a certain audience. I think that's bad advice. When I write something, I completely ignore the audience. And this is advice I got from Peter Elbow. Focus on your message. You can worry later about who's going to read it. When you're all done, then you can think about where you're going to send it. If it's a scientific paper, which journal, if it's creative, et cetera, which magazine, et cetera. Don't think about that while you're writing. It's kind of like editing while you're in the middle of it, like putting on your makeup before you take your shower, et cetera. When you're done, then you'll know what journal to send it to, what magazine to send it to, et cetera. Secret number 14, a good rule of life: expect rejection. Everybody gets rejected. Nobody talks about it. There's a wonderful book I highly recommend. It's called Rotten Reviews. It's these wonderful authors, all very well known, and they shared their letters of rejection from journals, from publishers, some of the greatest writers. Everything was rejected for years and years and years. Finally, they got it right, et cetera, and they got accepted. Rejection is universal. In my case, my journal papers, I actually am doing pretty well. I think I have a much higher level of acceptance than most people, but most of my papers are rejected. I'd say more than half. I have to revise them, try again, another journal, et cetera. When I get a rejection letter or tough criticism or any criticism, the first thing you do, don't put it aside, read it carefully, make notes. If the criticisms are wrong, ignore it, forget it, send it somewhere else. If the criticisms are right, deal with them. The person is doing you a big, big favor. Don't let it sit around, eat your insides out, get you all bitter. The world hates me, it's unfair. Deal with it right away. Important papers eventually get published. There was a very interesting study of some of the top papers in the field, how many were rejected. Big journals reject 3/4 of what's submitted to them. Very interesting study done by some scholars. The paper I'm going to tell you about, by the way, was rejected and then eventually published. They looked at journals, some of the classic papers in psychology, the ones that were considered landmark breakthroughs. They changed the name of the author and they made up the name and they resubmitted it to the same journal, say 10 years later. Most of them were rejected, usually for methodological problems. The reviewers didn't even notice that their journal had published the paper. So it's kind of arbitrary. A lot of good papers get turned down, but the studies show if you persevere and keep doing it, the good papers eventually get accepted. This is true of me in journal papers. I also write letters to the editor to newspapers, which is wonderful exercise of saying things concisely, getting to the point. And I would say 95% of my letters are professional. It's from my expertise as a researcher, et cetera. Occasionally I say nasty things about Donald Trump, but I hope that won't be necessary after the day is over. Nearly all are rejected. Letters to the editor, 95% are rejected. 5% are published. I get about 10% published. That's considered pretty good. Learn to live with rejection. It's not you, it's the way the system works. Okay, how to do research, how to find topics for all kinds of research. People say it has to be new, breakthrough stuff, okay? One of my most admired researchers is a guy named Morris Halle. Morris Halle was a professor of linguistics at MIT. He and Noam Chomsky worked together, okay? They did a book called Sound Patterns of English, which turned the field of phonological analysis upside down. It was absolutely brilliant. Well, Morris Halle went to a conference and he brought in some research done and reanalyzed it. Research done about 20, 30 years ago. People in the audience objected. They said, this is old stuff. Why are you telling us this old stuff? He said, I'm not here to give you the news. I'm here to give you the truth. Old research counts. Old research that's been forgotten, that needs to be reanalyzed. Let me tell you more about old research, which is very dear to my heart. A guy named Simonton, again, asked this question in one of his books on science and research. When you think of the top scholars in their fields, people who are representative of the work of their times, representative of what we call the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. In linguistics, of course, it's Noam Chomsky. In anthropology, Margaret Mead represented what anthropology was when she was working. Would you say that their ideas are with the times or ahead of the times? The answer, according to Dean Keith Simonton, neither. They're typically behind the times. They're typically involved with ideas that are no longer popular, that have been forgotten. They're scholars that look at the past. Chomsky brought up these ideas about innateness from French philosophy that had been long forgotten, okay, and brought it back. In my case, I've done that. This is one of the most exciting times. This happened at the University of Southern California, where I did a lot of work sitting in what was called the Education Library on campus. Very nice place to work. And during breaks, I could go browse journals and all that. It's quiet, etc. And in browsing journals, one of my favorite sections was a journal of English language arts. And one day I started looking at articles published between 1880 and 1910, just browsing through. One of my interests at the time was on the relationship between instruction, reading, and good spelling. I was doing studies of this already. And I found some papers written in 1890, 1902. One of them was called The Futility of the Spelling Grind. Both articles said spelling instruction doesn't work. They looked at spelling scores of children over the years. One guy looked at the relationship to how much spelling instruction they had and compared it to students who were excused from spelling instruction because they were good spellers. They found instruction didn't matter. The kids who were already good spellers kept improving without instruction. Those with zero instruction improved just as much. Now, the thing about 1902 and 1897 is that they didn't have our modern statistics. So my student, Howard White, and I entered their stuff into their data into our mighty USC computers. We did the t-tests, the regressions, the correlations. And these guys back in 1897, 1905 were absolutely right. It was wonderful. I got to tell you what happened next, because it's a nice tale of rejection. We wrote up this, I thought, wonderful paper. We said, I won't mention any names. Yes, I will. The Reading Research Quarterly, the #1 snob journal in reading. Okay. I published only one thing there. It just barely got in. And we sent it to them. They rejected it by return mail. You could tell they didn't even open it. And they said, we are not a spelling journal. We are a reading journal. Well, our conclusion was that spelling comes from reading. You'd think they'd be interested. They didn't even get that far. We did not bother trying to persuade them. We simply sent it to another journal. It was published right away. And let that be a good example to you. And the paper, I think, has done a lot of good, taking the pressure off useless time spent etc., and torturing kids, making them do spelling exercises that don't really work, okay? So my conclusion from all of this, if you have an idea, you don't always have to go out and get new data. You can see what happened in the past. You make a prediction. You go to the library and find that someone did the same study 50 years ago and got what you thought. That counts. You can report on that. That's interesting. And you are honoring the past. You are honoring the lineage. And you'll see, you make sure that these people did not spend that time in vain. It is the best thing you can do to honor their efforts. Well, we've been doing this too. What we've been doing is what we call secondary analysis. That's what I did with the spelling data. Go back, look at old data, apply statistical tests that they didn't have. Something called meta-analysis, which I'm very excited about. In meta-analysis, you take a field and you look at all the studies that have ever been done, statistical analyses. Each study you can boil down into one number called an effect size, and you can tell whether the whole field made progress. Those are lovely, wonderful papers. The other way of working, something we're excited about now, is what we call unobtrusive research. This I got interested in the 1980s when I had a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Ottawa. And in their library, again, browsing over the shelves, I found a book called Unobtrusive Measures. I read it. It was like reading a novel. It talked about doing research when your subjects don't even know that you're doing it. It takes no time for them, nothing, and it costs nothing. The book was full of great examples, and we're going to be bringing this up to date in a moment. One of my favorite examples from the book is an automobile dealer in Chicago who dealt with Chevrolets. He sold Chevrolets, and he had a Chevrolet repair shop. People would bring in their Chevrolets to be fixed. And he wanted to know what radio station he should advertise his company on, his salesman, his car sales place. What do? Do you go out and ask people, what are you listening to, et cetera? No, very easy. He went into the repair shop. He asked the mechanics to look where the radio dial was set on the cars that were taken in for repair. Wasn't that brilliant? Those are the radio stations that Chevrolet drivers listen to. This is wonderful. We have to think of more ways of doing these things. Another study was done during the time when alcohol was declared illegal in the United States, and they wanted to know how many people were drinking beer and wine. They looked at their garbage to see how many bottles they were throwing out and what they were. That is unobtrusive research. In the book, Unobtrusive Measures, it introduces some people who did what we call wear and tear studies. They wanted to know if certain books were popular. They went into local public libraries, took the books off the shelf, and looked to see where the pages were worn. Certain books, you can tell how far people got, because after a certain while, there are no thumbprints, there are no smudge marks, the papers aren't folded. Our colleague, Jeff McQuillan, did this in a paper called How Many People Really Use the Berlitz Method, okay? He went to the local public library and took down all the books from the shelf that were how to learn a foreign language, how to improve your French, okay? And he looked to see where the marks were in the books. His conclusion, people read about 15% of the books. After that, the pages were crisp and clean. A member of today's audience, Nishan Ashtari, who's a teacher on the faculty at USC, did the same thing with what we call heritage language development. Heritage language is how serious are we with helping children acquire the language of their home, which may not be the language of the community. It's called the heritage language. And we think there are very good reasons for helping children keep the heritage language. As you know, in the United States, that's largely Spanish. In other countries, other languages, etc. My heritage language is Yiddish, but there's not much to read. Anyway, Nushan Ashtari in our audience today did the same thing with Farsi, Persian. Now, she did it in a neighborhood where there were lots of families from Iran who spoke Farsi at home. Generally, what we find is that the small children may pick up a little bit of Farsi from mom and dad, the abuelos, et cetera, who are around, but generally not too much because there really aren't effective heritage language classes. She went to a library, this is again, very clever design, where there were lots of Farsi speakers in the neighborhood, Iranian families. She took down the books from the shelf that had anything to do with Farsi. All of them were pedagogical, how to learn Farsi, Farsi grammars. The average person who took a book out and started looking at it read about 5%. It showed there's not enough materials around, and it shows that the methodology is wrong. All this is done with no knowledge of the people. You don't have to bother people. You have to give them a questionnaire. Would you do this for me, et cetera? No cost. And we get marvelous, marvelous results. This is the wear and tear study, an easy way of doing research. I'm always looking for easy ways that give you the same things. We also find collaborative research. Another reasonably unobtrusive study was done by Dr. Ashtari. She went into a couple of bookstores in the Westwood area in Los Angeles. There were, again, Iranian bookstores, Farsi books, and talked to the owners. What kind of books do you have? Mostly grammar books and classics that even she, well-educated speaker of Farsi, would have a rough time getting through deep philosophy. No wonder, no wonder. You go to classes, they're grammar classes, they're boring, and this is all leading to a very powerful discussion. We're kind of doing our best to turn people off to doing the heritage language. I want to talk also about a problem that I've had, that Dr. Ashtari and I both have, and we're trying to cure ourselves of each of it, and not doing a good job, I'm afraid, because it's so easy to give in. I call it infatuation. We have a problem with infatuation. Whenever we talk about our research, it's always something new, and we always find it fascinating. And we have to resist the temptation, because it's such an interesting idea, of dropping everything and rushing off to the new idea. We have to discipline ourselves to stay with the old idea and work on it. There's been some research on this, and I found this very useful. It's helping me do more, be more self-disciplined. It says in my list here, resist acting on infatuation with ideas outside your main interest. Here's Simonton: the successful psychologist is one whose research program concentrates on a small set of interrelated topics. Don't spread out too thin. The ones who contribute a natural development from one group of ideas to the others, etc. This is not easy to do. Well, I promised in my title again, 17 Secrets of Academic Writing and a Declaration of War. There's a new sheriff in town. I'm declaring war today on academia and academic publishers. This is one of our big problems at the university. May not be for some of you, maybe for some of you it is. First of all, scholars at the university in the fields of education complain a lot about teachers. Teachers don't read anything. And the implication is they're anti-intellectual. And only we at the university understand things, and they should read more and listen to us. There's a good, actually, they're kind of right in that teachers don't do a lot of academic reading. I know this, I look at citations of my papers, how many are there? Okay, but not everybody reads them. And there's pretty good reason why. And I'm trying to do a better job. Number one, most articles in our fields, if you've read stuff in second language and literacy and education, most articles in our field are much too long and much too boring. Someone once said, when you want to know the time, you don't want someone to give you a history of the wristwatch, and that's what people do. Now, I am probably a better reader than 99.9% of people in my field because I've been at it for such a long time. I've been reading this stuff for over 50 years, so I'm pretty good at it. I can't get through this stuff. There's too much. I also have more free time than most people in the field. In fact, now I have nothing but free time being home during quarantine. I'm reading all the time. I can't get through it. They're too long, they're too long, they're too long, and they're too boring. So, and I've talked about some of this when I talked about how to do a scientific paper. You don't need to review the whole research. You don't need to give people advice on what to do next. Keep it short. Very important. I was inspired by Crick and Watson. They were the researchers who discovered the double helix, the DNA, RNA kind of circle diagram, et cetera. They wrote it up. Their first article about it was in the journal Nature. It was 2 pages. If you understood and remembered at least some of high school biology, you could get a pretty good idea of what they were doing. That is wonderful. What I do from now on is in the last 6, 7 years, I've been only writing short papers, 2 pages, 3 pages, maybe 4 or 5. I also do a lot of reviewing for journals, at least I used to. Journals would write me all the time, would you review this article? Tell us if we should publish it. 5 years ago, I put a new limit on it. I said, I will only review papers that are 5 pages or less. I have not reviewed a single professional paper since that time, the last 5 years. They're all long, 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 long. So someone has to put a stop to it, and I've decided I will do my share. I love doing it. It's a responsibility, but mostly these papers are much too long, redundant, etc. They don't have to be that long. So number 1, they have to be short. Number 2, they have to be clearly written. There was a great study done at USC, my university, in the School of Medicine. Junior members of the faculty were responsible for finding people to give the in-services, the guest lectures. And they hired, this is a practical joke they decided to play on the faculty. They got a guy who was a professional actor, who had appeared in movies and television playing the part of a doctor. He wasn't a class A actor. He's kind of a class B minus, a superb actor, but not really well-known. It wasn't, Cary Grant or one of these well-known actors or Denzel Washington. It was just this guy you occasionally see, and I've seen him before, but he was an excellent actor. They chose him deliberately. They gave him a script of a new breakthrough in medicine. The script was total nonsense. It was full of formulas, full of charts, full of hypotheses, and it was complete, as we say, gibberish, complete nonsense. It was voted the best guest lecture of the year. They thought it was wonderful. They couldn't have understood it because it was all nonsense. I see this all the time. I go to a lecture, a guest speaker that I didn't understand at all. And I asked, and they said, oh, that was great. I asked my colleagues, what did he say? They can never tell you. Because they don't understand it, they assume it must be wonderful. Sometimes people make things complex in order to avoid criticism. Chris Hedges has said this as a political writer. He says, if you write extremely complicated articles, don't be afraid of people criticizing you because no one's going to understand it. And people will respect you. You'll get tenure, promotion, etc. I have colleagues, that's all they do. It's really terrible because you never know when you get this long paper, there might be something important in it. So I try to make sure I read the whole thing. And frankly, I'm bitter about all this because I wasted a lot of time getting one small nugget out of 50 pages where it could have been done in 2. The journals reject too many papers because they don't have room for them. The Reading Research Quarterly, some great papers, but some of them are a waste of time, too much padding. They may have 5 articles in it. That's all. One of my favorite journals is called Perceptual and Motor Skills. Each issue is quite thick, but it'll have 50 papers in it. Papers 2-3 pages. You can get a real education that way. That's what we should do. There's also a financial problem. People don't read a lot. Teachers don't read a lot because they can't afford it. Journals are hideously expensive now. The typical professional journal in your field will cost you at least 50 American dollars a year, sometimes 100, sometimes 200. In my area, I read in all kinds of different, I read in first language, second language, literacy, all this stuff, grammar studies. I can't afford them, not even close. The only people who can do this are current university professors who have privileges at the local university library and can get copies made for them. And that's a tiny minority of people who should be reading it. The problem too, let's say you want a copy. You read an article in an expensive journal and gee, I need a copy. The journal will send you one, pay them 50 American dollars, $40. The journal gets the money, not the author. Well, there's a cure for all this, and it comes from the field of mathematics. My daughter-in-law told me all about it. It's called open access. That's today's new vocabulary word, open access. There is now a tendency for articles to be published in open access journals, made possible by the computer and word processing, etc. Open access journals don't charge the author anything. You know, if they charged a small amount, like $5, $10 American, I'd be happy to pay it. If it's more than that, like 100, it's what you call a vanity press, a vanity journal, simply to make money. They'll publish anything if you pay enough, and there are quite a few like that. But if it's nothing or small, it's open access journal. The author pays nothing. The reader pays nothing. I only publish now in open access journals. If you want to see what I've done and what my colleagues have done, I mentioned Dr. Ashtari, she does this too. Jeff McQuillan, I mentioned him. He does that too. Beniko Mason, my colleague from Japan, she does that too. We all do this now. They're journals that are posted on the internet for free. They don't charge you. Anybody can read it. This is what we're aiming for now. Again, if they charged a little bit, I would pay the little bit to keep them going, but not $50, $100, $200 a year. I can't afford it. I don't know anyone who can afford these things and the price of books, etc. I learned my lesson with all this in 2007, 2008. I was asked to contribute an article to a book, an edited volume on the topic of input. Since I was one of the pioneers of input, they asked me to do an article. And let me tell you, I did an article and I had such a good time. I wrote this long paper. I think it was the last long paper I've ever written, but it was a lot of fun. I gave into my infatuations. I gave into temptation, okay? And I just included whatever I was interested in. I talked about my work in literacy, first language, second language. I had a section on animal language. Does the comprehension hypothesis fit animals learning animal language and human language, chimpanzees doing sign, all this? And pretty much actually came pretty close. I also had a section, this is how self-indulgent I was. What happens when the aliens land from Zeta Reticula and Alpha Centauri? How are we going to talk to them? I looked at what Star Trek said about it, their languages, etc. And I wrote, a page of speculation. I made it a long footnote. Most of the movies are disappointed, science fiction. Turns out it's telepathy. And in the movies, they all speak English with a British accent. I've never figured that out. Anyway, you know what? Nobody read it. If you give in to temptation and you put an article in a journal like that, no one is going to read it. They can't afford it. When the book came out, it was $160 for a hardcover copy. The soft cover was $85. At author's discount, I couldn't afford extra copies. I got 2 free copies, that was all. So I love giving copies of my books to my cousins and all that. And here's this one, oh, thank you, which they'll put on their shelf and it's fine. But we can't do it. We can't order these books anymore. I found out why. So, several publishers whom I knew well told me the reason. They confessed. And they told me not to tell anyone, which is why I'm telling you. They have a captive audience, university libraries. If you have a book, your publisher that sells for $100, $200, and it's a technical book, All the university libraries will have to order it, and they'll come out ahead. They'll make plenty of money. And if you have an article in that book, it is doomed to oblivion. No one is going to read it because they can't get access to it. So this is no good. In my opinion, well, I'm very aware of the serious implications of this financially. If we do what I'm recommending, it is a disaster for the publishing industry. It's the end of the publishing industry as we know it. It's the end of most textbooks, which are poorly written and full of expensive figures, diagrams. They cost a lot. Kids can't afford them. They Xerox them and all that, which is very awkward to do. We're going to have to do different. We're going to have our students read collections of short free articles, et cetera. That will be the future. And that's going to be a painful transition. And I'm very sorry about that. It is a multi-trillion-dollar disaster for the textbook industry. The textbook people are going to have to figure out another way of making a living. And we can't help that. I recommend they start now. Instead, what many of them are doing is continuing along the same path, charging even more. And more scholars are writing textbooks because they think they can make money. That is my sermon today. It is time for you to ask me very difficult questions and tell you I haven't the slightest idea how to answer them. So, I'm supposed to look in the chat box. Okay. Okay. I hate people who use complicated words. I'm with you, Paula. All right. Can you obtain a recording of this webinar? Please do, from the people organizing it. Okay, it's fine with me. Oh, all this stuff is just saying how much you enjoyed the talk. Gosh, thank you. That's so wonderful. And Nushan has, good. Nushan has posted a link to her paper, The Case of Farsi, which we co-authored. Please take a look. You can download it for free. It's in ResearchGate and lots of other really good things. I think they're going to close down ResearchGate someday. They're kind of violating the law. I think it's good. It's a law that should be violated and broken. Okay. All right. Yeah, will the webinar be available? I think so. I'll see this, and Graham Wallace is mentioned. Thanks, Nishan, again. Boy, that one should be, that was called The Art of Thought, and that should be really read by a lot of people. Just because it's old doesn't mean it's bad. I'm here to give you the truth, not the news. Okay, don't be afraid of making mistakes. Mistakes are good. It's good with language too. Let me tell you one example about how language works and mistakes. I am an intermediate speaker of Spanish. I can speak Spanish. I can have a conversation. Yo puedo hablar español. No es perfecto, pero. And people will answer me in Spanish, and that's fine. I can read authentic books in Spanish. Last summer, I finally read my first book by Isabella Allende. Wow, is she good? You guys already know this. I read Zorro. It was a little too hard for me, but the story was so good. She pulls you along. You really want to know what's on the next paragraph, etc. But in general, it's a little hard. And there are certain things I have not yet acquired in Spanish. It's good to have an intermediate language, all right? This is very important. Some languages I'm better at, some I'm not so good, some I'm terrible. That's helpful for the theoretical work. In Spanish, you'll know exactly where I am when I tell you this. Consider the difference between ser and estar. I know the rule. I can tell you all about it. I have not acquired it. It doesn't come easily. If I want to get it right, I've got to think about it and monitor, put it in the right place. And that means I have to think about it with nearly every sentence. It means I can't get out a single sentence without worrying. And that inhibits me in Spanish. Well, I took the advice of a mutual friend of ours, Steve Kaufman. Steve Kaufman is a polyglot, no kidding. He speaks 20 languages and he's for real. I've been with him with 3 of them in social situations, a couple of which I speak fairly well, and he is excellent, one of them Chinese. Anyway, that's one of the ones I don't do well on. Anyway, Steve gives this advice. Oh, by the way, of his 20 languages, 6 of them he has acquired since age 60. Isn't that encouraging? Anyway, I got an invitation to go to Mexico last year to spend a week, no, summer before last, at the home of some friends of mine in Cuernavaca. They own a language school. It's the Phoenix Language School. And I've known them for years. We're good buddies, et cetera. And the faculty of the school is one family and they all live in the same house. And I stay there with them. And I had lunch and dinner with the family for a whole week and a half every day. And lunch usually means charlar, basically gossip, talk about people. We're all firm believers in the idea, if you don't have anything good to say about someone, sit next to me. Good idea. That was actually Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice. And I decided I would take Steve Kaufman's advice. He said, don't worry about your mistakes. Nobody cares. The real world is not language class. The real world, people are interested in what you're saying. They're not interested in correcting. So I decided for my next week and a half, hanging out with my friends in Cuernavaca, I simply would not worry about ser and estar. I would just come out with whatever was there. Estaba, era. I just wouldn't even worry about the difference. That was such a relief. First of all, nobody corrected me. Nobody commented. I'm sure I made lots of mistakes. And I had the best time socially than I've ever had with these people. We've always gotten along well, but this was especially true because I wasn't monitoring. I think the same thing's true with intellectual things. You make a mistake, you'll figure it out. You'll get the right input in general. You will grow intellectually, you'll grow linguistically, all the same thing. Okay, folks. Otra preguntas hay más? Okay. Well, people are busy introducing themselves. Oh my, that's great. Yes, right. I love when my students communicate in English. That goes to another point that I'd like to discuss. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. It's not the only way to improve accuracy. In fact, you won't improve your accuracy simply by talking. You'll get better by listening and reading. In Mexico, I got better because I was part of the conversation. I probably didn't get any better with ser and estar because they were late acquired. I wasn't ready. I'm probably still not ready for it. That's going to come later. But I probably did better acquiring a lot of other things that they used, all subconsciously. I am not in favor of speaking practice in class, having students form groups and talk to each other in conversations, because they're all pretty much at the same level. That's why they're in the same class. And they're making pretty much the same mistakes, so you're not making progress. I'll tell you about an interesting result Dr. Ashtari had some years ago before we met. She interviewed people in California who were speakers of English as a second language, and they were taking classes, ESL classes. And they admitted in discussion that they were afraid of talking to native speakers. The native speakers didn't understand them, or as we suspect, pretended they didn't understand them, weren't patient enough, etc. And they had a similar problem when they talked to you, you didn't understand what they're saying if you're a beginner. When I was, my first experience as a foreign student was in Vienna when I was a music student. This is back in the 1960s. Important to know that because in those years, English was not the universal language then. When people in my class, we spoke German outside of class. That was our common language. Today, everybody would be speaking English, I know. And it turned out it was a good experience. It turned out it was a good experience because I got to know other second language speakers who were slightly better than I was through social interaction, which meant the mistakes they made were beyond where I was anyway. So I was getting the right input for me. I also met more native speakers through them, social connections, and they made recommendations for good books. What Dr. Ashtari found in her questionnaire study was that lower levels, intermediates, low intermediates, are far more eager to socialize with second language acquirers like themselves. than with native speakers. I was the same way. And we're beginning to wonder, maybe this is good to speak to others who are acquiring the language as well, who at least enough of them are beyond where you are and can give you what we call I+1 language that you haven't acquired. So that's one place where talking will help, but it helps indirectly because you get the other people to talk to you. Okay.
Professor Krashen, there are a couple of questions inside of the Q&A box, and
Okay.
I'll read one of them.
Please do.
Says, Mr. Krashen, do you have any advice for those people who want to start researching or making research writing, like pre-service teachers questions?
No. No advice. I'll give you advice on how to write it up and good ways of doing studies, but it's got to come from you, Grasshopper. It's kind of come from you. It's got to be an idea that burns inside of you. Listen to other people's suggestions, but you'll know when it's the right project for you. And then your heart will be in it. A good place to start, though, is replication. Look at what someone else has done. Do the same study or take it a little further, but it's got to be something that really strikes you as important. We all have our own path, and it's slightly different for all of us, and you have to find your path. If you find someone who's on a similar path or close by, and I've been very lucky that way, you can collaborate, get ideas, and look at your friends who have died 100 years ago. Look at the old studies, replicate those. That is honoring the lineage. Read the research and write short papers. I can't tell you what to do. I can tell you what I like, and you can tell from my writing, I like more studies of reading. I like studies of access to books, whether they're there. I like studies testing the idea that, reading is the source of our vocabulary, our knowledge makes you smarter, all these ideas that I think are important. But what you work on has to come from you. You can look at what other people have done, but I wouldn't follow orders.
Okay, great. Another question is, what kind of exercises do you recommend for beginning writers or for someone that's in high school to try to motivate them into this trend or this like tendency to be a writer?
No exercises, only the real thing, okay? I would say do the reading and be narrow in areas you like. One of the things about Hans Ohanian's books, his book about Einstein, he talks about Einstein and Isaac Newton. And they both were not great students because they both got interested in their own areas of physics that they liked and ignored most of the stuff that was going on in classes. And thank God they did the right thing because we had all this genius work from them. They didn't always do the right thing, looking back historically. But what are you going to do? Isaac Newton, in his later years, got interested in alchemy, turning ordinary stuff into gold. And actually, he thought that was some of his best work. What are you going to do? But he did so much wonderful work. He basically invented basic mechanics. In physics, he invented calculus. This, by the way, calculus he did during the plague. It's kind of like what's going on now. When people were stuck in their own homes and he had nothing else to do. And for several months, he invented calculus and worked on basic physics and changed the world, okay? But he decided what he was going to work on. No exercises. You start writing when you've got something to write about. And the trick is be willing to change it and realize, again, Hemingway, the most useful comment ever, the first draft of anything is shit. And then it gets better and better and better. I hope that's helpful.
No, yeah, that's great. Another question. There's like 4 questions still. Thinking about our students and the need for them to start writing, how good or bad is it to push them into the rhythm of writing?
I think it's bad to push them into any writing.
Okay.
It has to come from yourself. And I don't know how to solve that in the school context when we have assignments, writing, etc. I think what we've learned from the research is that self-selected voluntary reading is the way to get literate. There's really no other path path that's anywhere near as effective. And in writing, it's writing that you need to do to solve a problem that burns inside of you. School does not honor that. In my opinion, school should be a place where you find out what your interests are. We're all different. We all have slightly different interests, which is great because it's the only way the human race can survive. If we all did the same thing. School makes a big mistake by insisting that everyone get good at the same thing. One of the best articles I read about this was about high school basketball. In high school basketball, secondary school basketball, the basketball coach encourages players to learn to dribble. You know basketball, it's a game where you get dressed in your underwear and you go running around bouncing a ball. That's basically it.
Pretty much.
Anyway, the coaches say, don't just dribble with your right hand, learn to dribble with your left. Don't just learn to shoot with your right hand, learn to shoot with your left. He says, that's all wrong. If you only work on your weak spots, you never get good at anything. You must work on your strong spots and make them even stronger. Aren't we glad that Denzel Washington became an actor and didn't work on becoming a physicist, okay? Aren't we glad that Stevie Wonder decided to become a singer and not a plumber or whatever, or a writer or whatever? These are the ones who've made huge contributions to humanity because they got better at what they were good at. School should help you recognize where your talents are, where your interests are, and help you get better. How do you work this into the curriculum? I don't know. I can only give partial advice. Repeat the wisdom of one of our heroes who said, do a little more of what's right and do less of what's wrong. That was Frank Smith, a wonderful writer in literacy. It's going to be a little at a time. And for those of us whose interests do not coincide with anything in school, it's a tough place. I didn't find out what I was good at and wanted to do till I was in my 20s. Linguistics didn't exist, and I was a mediocre student. I wasn't lazy. It just wasn't interesting. I tried my best, but it wasn't interesting. It was self-selected reading that made all the difference. In high school, just like you, I took literature classes, English literature. I did the assigned reading. I passed the tests. In my own time, I read mostly science fiction. I remember every science fiction novel that I read, every single one. I could tell you all about it. I don't remember anything of the assigned reading. It was like one in one ear and out the other. None of that stuff has ever mattered to anybody. I don't take recommendations from people. I select what I want, especially in fiction. In nonfiction, yes, I do listen to my colleagues. When they say, read this, it's important. But in fiction, it's what I want to read, what strikes me. And if I don't like the book, I put it down. How you integrate this into the school, that is our challenge. I don't know if it's going to be little by little or all at once, but we're gradually finding out what our goals are, and they seem right to me. Thanks for the question. Great one.
Okay, another question, if we have time. What would you say to a teacher who doesn't believe in writing or that writing is necessary in a foreign language classroom because communication is the primary focus?
Well, I agree. I don't think writing is necessary in a foreign language classroom. I think it's input that counts. I think it's oral input and reading. And if you want to write something, go ahead. Most of the gains for your students that they're going to make through writing are going to be through Spanish, through the primary language, because that's the one they know the best. That's the one where they can revise the best. Eventually, when they become professionals, and as professionals in today's world, they will be writing in English. The composing process, the importance of revision that they learned how to do in Spanish, they will apply to English, no problem at all. I've only written a couple of articles in other languages, usually with a team, and I have done drafts and revision, done a couple in French, and it's the same thing. I know that I have to revise. I read it over. I say, no, this isn't right. It's not, the grammar, making agreement rules and all that, but the composing process, easiest way, do it in the primary language, and it transfers to everything else. So I kind of agree that in basic foreign language, writing is not the main thing. It's listening and reading. Makes life a little easier.
Another question. Do you know about subconscious work in relation to languages? For example, how much do speakers dream in L1 or L2?
Well, the subconscious stuff, I think, is everything because acquisition is subconscious. It's acquisition, not learning, which is conscious. Dreaming, I don't know. I'm one of those who doesn't remember his dreams very well. I guess everybody's like that. And I've had a couple of dreams where there's been another language. I remember in Austria, I had one very lucid dream in German. Doesn't happen very often. I think so here's a hypothesis. It happens after you've reached a certain point, when you've gotten acquisition, not when you've gotten conscious learning. Learning the rules doesn't make you dream, but having a lot of conversation and a lot of reading, then you'll start dreaming in that language. I don't know if it does you any good, but I would guess that it's a result of acquisition. You want to go work on that? Let me know how it comes out.
This basically comes down to exposure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. I want to write, but I do not know how to start. I always work on my thesis about your 7 hypotheses. So what recommendations would you have for someone that wants to start writing and they have like the mental block, as you were saying before?
Realize the first draft is shit. Realize that you've got to find a narrow aspect of the topic that you think is important, where you have an insight and you have something to say. If you don't have a new idea, something new or an old idea you want to emphasize, don't bother writing. Find a part of the topic that glows in the dark for you. Good place to start: replication and case history. Take your own case, write where your experience has either validated or is contrary to what Krashen says. Write it out. We need so many more of these. We need to know what people's experiences have been. I've done a lot of case histories of former students. They've written them out, et cetera. I'm always interested in them. They don't prove, but they give you good evidence. They give you good evidence. One case history I read was a case history of a guy, he wrote it himself, of how he tried to learn German. He was originally from France and he went to Germany to study, and he thought the way to do it was to memorize the grammar book. He memorized all the rules, the regular verbs, etc. He showed up at the university, tried to understand lectures, understood 0, then went back, believe it or not, memorized the entire dictionary, everything in it. He still understood 0. Then he said, well, I've got to go over the roots a little more, learn the grammar. Nothing ever happened. He reached the point where he could artificially construct a sentence from the grammar rules. And when people looked at it, when he said it to people, they just stared at him and then started to laugh. He did everything the classical way told him to do, the way you did Latin and Greek in those days, and it got him absolutely nowhere. Of course, when he got home to France, he realized that his 2-year-old nephew had mastered French during the time he was gone, simply by playing around and having a good time listening to people. So the case histories are amazingly good. I would do your own case histories, interview people. Have you tried this? What has helped? What hasn't? But your own case is probably the best place to start.
Excellent. There's only 3 more questions. What do you think of journals as a tool of improving writing skills in a target language?
Only if they're interesting and compelling. Only if the article is something that you really, really, really want to read. Compelling means so interesting you forget that it's in another language. That's what we're looking for. Read things in other languages that are totally hypnotic, where you no longer know that it's English, and that's when you're improving. Try that. So journal papers count when they're exciting. Reading fiction is never a waste of time. Our current research shows you get a huge amount of academic language from reading fiction. Jeff McQuillan found a paper, reported on it, where the authors found that if you read 1 million words of science fiction, that's like a year's worth to an advanced student, you get half of the words you need for all sciences It's all there. Let me tell you about my cousin, Evelyn. Okay. I love talking about Evelyn. Evelyn's one of the people I love the most in the world. She's my cousin. She's now 93, and she was my mother's best friend. They had a wonderful aunt-niece relationship, so I honor that. Evelyn is now in her 90s, and her late husband, Marty, was also a very nice guy, was a lawyer. Well, he had practiced, he got a law degree, but never practiced. And Evelyn said, Marty knew so much about the law, and it was so interesting. And he really used it in daily life. I'm going to take a class in the legal system. I said, Evelyn, don't do that. Try this. Read John Grisham's law novels. She's been doing that. She says, I know so much more about the law than I ever did. And it's all so interesting and painless. It's through fiction that we learn about the world, that we get specialized vocabulary. Fiction has been vastly underplayed. So I would tell the person not to start with journal papers, but read lots of fiction in areas that you like, that you think is interesting, that's easy, and then eventually you can get to the journals.
Perfect. Okay, 2 more questions. As an English teacher, do you think a good way to motivate my students would be to write a personal diary?
For them to write the diary, neither the, well, if they could read your diary and all your adventures, they probably would enjoy it. But I wouldn't ask them to write a diary unless it has to do with the topic that's really important to them. And let me tell you, if you're in Chile and you're a student taking English classes, you don't want to write a diary in English. You want to write a diary in Spanish about your own life experiences and what's on your mind. Then it really counts. Then you grow emotionally and intellectually through reflection. I wouldn't worry about it as a way of doing a second language. Maybe later when you get real good.
Perfect. All right, the last question says, Professor Krashen, should we give our students extra time for editing? You said that students shouldn't worry about grammar, pronunciation, or punctuation, spelling when writing. So when you are assessing a writing activity, you usually give them a limited time. How could teachers get the best out of this activity?
Okay, for a change, let me give you a radical idea.
Perfect.
Let's not test writing at all, ever. Testing writing is always a problem. First of all, it will encourage teachers to assign more writing and for students to do more writing because they're going to be tested on it. But more writing does not make you a better writer. Number 2, testing writing is one of the most painful things we do. You have to read the paper, you have to make the marks, and it is awful. And the corrections you make will not help the students at all. They won't even look at them, as you know. And it's hard to give reliable grades for writing. Inter-rater reliability is very low. The criteria are never clear, and it is a huge time waster. The same goes for speaking. I would not test speaking. Let's not test writing. Let's not test speaking. It's going to encourage us to do more of them, and that doesn't help. And grading people on it and giving them feedback is always hard to do. Raters never agree with each other, and it won't help anyone. It'll just make you frustrated. If you want to test something, test reading. And the only way to get better in reading is to do a lot of it. Do a lot of it in an area you think is exciting. And when we test reading, let's let students, within reason, test the area they want to read about. Like if someone likes history, give them a reading passage. If they want an adventure story, give them an adventure story. The reading test should reflect the genres that kids like. It should test what they know, not what they don't know. Make life, and it's going to save billions of dollars every year.
That's great advice. I think variety in what kids like to read is going to definitely push them forward into that area, not force them to do it.
Let me add something to that. You need access to good reading material. We need to fill our libraries with wonderful books in both languages so they can have something to choose from.
That was the last question, Professor Krashen, and I just want to say thank you. I mean, it's been a very long webinar, but very interesting. The stuff you were telling everyone about the process, and I think that everybody appreciated the comments. And if there's
very good.
If there's any other things that that I missed, I don't know if I missed any questions here and there in the chat box, but I think we covered most of them.
Let me make a request.
Yeah, sure.
Please feel free to follow me on Twitter. On Twitter, I am Krashen, and that's a very good way of sharing information rapidly. And I announce new articles by myself, other people. Check out ResearchGate, where you can find articles posted by me. Dr. Ashtari has done that. My colleagues, Jeff McQuillan, Nico Mason, a lot of people have done that. That's where you'll find the latest stuff, and it's free. And when you publish something, put it on ResearchGate. Okay.
Great advice. Once again, thank you so much. As most people are commenting in the chat box, they're just very, very thankful for your participation in the webinar today. And obviously it's an opportunity for most of us as teachers and educators to actually talk to one of the great minds behind a lot of hypotheses that we had to study in the university, in master's programs and things like that. So it was just a great opportunity. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure. Good luck. Do a lot of junk reading, but stay away from junk food.